It was the 18th of March 1918 when Lieutenant Hans Weiss of Jagdstaffel 32 climbed down from the cockpit of his Albatros D.5 with his hands still trembling. The mission report he dictated to his commanding officer that evening contained a phrase that would be repeated in dozens of other German reports in the following weeks. The British aeroplane seemed to violate the laws of physics at altitudes below 500 meters. Weiss had intercepted a formation of Sopwith Camels above the Ypres salient. At 4,000 meters altitude, he had engaged what he considered a relatively easy target. The Camel had an ambiguous reputation among German pilots: unstable, capricious, a killer of its own pilots. But what happened next defied everything Weiss had learned in his 18 months of combat flying. The two aircraft had spiraled downward in the classic dance of Western Front dogfighting. Weiss had positioned himself perfectly, using the superior high-altitude performance of his Albatros to maintain the advantage. At 2,000 meters, he was still confident. At 1,000 meters, he began to notice something strange. At 500 meters, his world turned upside down. The Sopwith Camel, which moments before had seemed sluggish and predictable, suddenly transformed into something else entirely. It pivoted on its axis like a compass needle finding north. The turn radius collapsed to something Weiss would later describe as impossible, geometrically impossible. He pulled his control column hard into his lap, feeding full rudder, expecting his Albatros to follow its usual tight arc. Instead, the British machine simply rotated around him, appearing in his peripheral vision, then behind him, then on his tail in what felt like two heartbeats. Weiss survived that encounter only because the British pilot's guns jammed. He dove away at full throttle, his Albatros shaking with the strain, and did not level out until he was skimming the treetops at 200 meters. Even then, he kept looking back over his shoulder, expecting that strange little biplane to be there, rotating impossibly, defying everything he understood about aerodynamics. What Weiss did not know, what none of the German pilots knew in the spring of 1918, was that they were encountering not just a different aircraft, but a different physics problem. And the answer to that problem lay not in the skill of the pilots or the power of the engines, but in something far more fundamental: the relationship between mass, rotation, and altitude. This is the story of how British engineers accidentally created the most dangerous fighter aircraft of World War I, not through superior firepower or speed, but through a quirk of physics that even the designers did not fully understand. By the time the war ended, the Sopwith Camel had killed more German pilots than any other Allied aircraft. It had also killed more British pilots in training than any other type. And the reason for both statistics was exactly the same: an effect so counterintuitive that pilots literally could not believe what their instruments were telling them until they experienced it firsthand. We are going to discover how a rotary engine, a short fuselage, and the density of air combined to create a weapon that rewrote the rules of aerial combat. We will see how this phenomenon accounted for 1,394 confirmed victories, more than any other Allied fighter. And we will understand why, even today, pilots who fly replica camels describe the experience as flying a gyroscope with wings. The Western Front in early 1918 was a place of desperate calculation. Germany had launched Operation Michael, its final gamble to break through Allied lines before American reinforcements could tip the balance. In the air, the statistics were brutal. The average life expectancy of a British fighter pilot on the Western Front was measured not in months, but in weeks. Some squadrons calculated it at 11 flying hours. The Germans held air superiority through much of 1917, flying highly capable aircraft like the Albatros D series and the new Fokker Dr. Point Y triplane. British and French losses mounted. The RFC, the Royal Flying Corps, was bleeding pilots faster than training schools could replace them. The strategic problem was straightforward but seemingly unsolvable. German fighters controlled the airspace above 3,000 meters. They had more powerful engines, better altitude performance, and crucially, oxygen systems that allowed their pilots to function effectively above 5,000 meters. British fighters like the SE.5A and the earlier Sopwith Pup could compete at these altitudes, but only just. They were outclimbed, outrun, and often outmaneuvered. The RFC needed something different. What they got was the Camel. The Sopwith Aviation Company had been designing fighters since 1915. Thomas Sopwith and his chief designer Herbert Smith understood aircraft structures, but they were working within severe constraints. British engine production in 1917 was chaotic. The most available power plants were rotary engines, specifically the Clerget 9B and the Bentley BR.1. These were not ideal engines. They were crude, fuel inefficient, and had a peculiar operating principle that would prove to be both the Camel's greatest strength and its deadliest weakness. In a rotary engine, the crankshaft remains stationary while the entire engine block and propeller rotate around it. The cylinders, pistons, crankcase, and propeller all spin as a single unit at engine speed. This creates enormous gyroscopic forces. Smith designed the Camel around this engine, but he made several decisions that seemed logical at the time, but would have profound unintended consequences. First, he placed the engine as far forward as possible to maximize the moment arm for control surfaces. Second, he designed an extremely short fuselage to save weight and improve maneuverability. Third, he concentrated all the major masses, engine, fuel tanks, guns, and pilot, within a 2-meter section of the aircraft's length. The result was an aircraft with roughly 60% of its total mass located in the forward third of the fuselage. This was an unprecedented mass distribution. Most aircraft of the era had more balanced weight distribution to ensure stable flight characteristics. The numbers were stark. A fully loaded Sopwith Camel had a total weight of approximately 660 kilograms. Of this, the Clerget 9B rotary engine weighed 164 kilograms. The 2 Vickers machine guns and ammunition added another 36 kilograms. The fuel tank, positioned directly behind the engine, held approximately 100 liters of castor oil-based fuel mixture, weighing another 80 kilograms when full. The pilot, in full flight gear, added 70 to 90 kilograms. This meant that nearly 400 kilograms of the aircraft's total mass was concentrated between the propeller hub and the pilot's seat, a span of less than 2 meters. The rear fuselage, empennage, and control surfaces accounted for barely 100 kilograms. What Smith and Sopwith had created, though they did not realize it, was essentially a gyroscope with wings attached. And like any gyroscope, it had properties that emerged from the physics of rotating masses. When a mass rotates around an axis, it resists changes to the orientation of that axis. This resistance is called gyroscopic precession. The faster the rotation and the greater the mass, the stronger the effect. In the Camel, you had a 164-kilogram engine rotating at 1,200 revolutions per minute. The gyroscopic momentum of this spinning mass was enormous. But here's where the story becomes interesting, where the physics textbooks meet the reality of combat. Gyroscopic precession has a peculiar property. When you apply a force to a spinning gyroscope, the gyroscope responds not in the direction of the force, but 90 degrees ahead in the direction of rotation. Push down on a spinning bicycle wheel and it turns left or right. Pull up and it turns the opposite direction. The Camel's rotary engine, spinning clockwise when viewed from the cockpit, created exactly this effect. When the pilot pulled back on the control stick to climb, the nose did rise, but the aircraft also yawed hard to the right. When he pushed forward to dive, the nose dropped and the aircraft yawed left. Every pitch input created an uncommanded yaw. Every yaw input created an uncommanded pitch. The aircraft was constantly trying to rotate in ways the pilot did not intend. At high altitude, this was simply annoying and dangerous. Pilots learned to anticipate the yaw and apply opposite rudder. They learned to never make a sharp control input because the aircraft would depart from controlled flight. They learned that the Camel would spin without warning if mishandled, and that the spin was often unrecoverable. Training units reported that fully 40% of Camel accidents occurred during the first 10 hours of flight time, when pilots were still learning to anticipate the gyroscopic effects. The Camel earned its nickname among flight instructors, the spinning incinerator. Between June 1917 and November 1918, training accidents in Yalin. Camels killed over 400 British pilots, more than twice the rate of any other type in RFC service. But then something unexpected happened. Combat pilots who survived the learning curve began reporting that the Camel had one specific capability that no other aircraft could match. Below 1,000 meters altitude, particularly below 500 meters, the Camel could outturn anything in the sky. Not by a small margin, but by an almost ridiculous factor. German pilots reported that Camels could complete a full 360-degree turn in the time it took an Albatross or Fokker to complete 200 degrees. Some reports claimed the Camel could pivot almost in place, like a weather vane. These reports were initially dismissed as exaggeration or misidentification, but they kept coming. And they were absolutely accurate. The explanation lay in a property of air that pilots in 1918 understood intuitively but had no instruments to measure. Air density. Air at sea level is approximately 14 times denser than air at 5,000 meters. This seems like an obvious statement, but its implications for the Camel were profound and counterintuitive. As air becomes denser, aerodynamic forces increase proportionally. Lift increases, drag increases, but crucially, the effectiveness of control surfaces increases. An elevator or rudder that produces a certain torque at high altitude produces dramatically more torque at low altitude because it is pushing against denser air. Now combine this with the Camel's gyroscopic properties. At high altitude, the thin air means weak control forces. The pilot has to make large control inputs to overcome the gyroscopic precession of the rotary engine. The aircraft responds sluggishly and unpredictably, but at low altitude, the control surfaces become much more powerful. The pilot can generate large torques with small inputs, and here's the critical insight. Those large torques act on an aircraft whose mass distribution is extremely concentrated. The moment of inertia about the vertical axis, the resistance to yaw rotation, is very small because so much mass is close to the center. The Camel has low rotational inertia but high gyroscopic momentum. At low altitude, the powerful control surfaces can overwhelm the gyroscopic effects and throw the lightweight rear fuselage around with tremendous authority. The result is an aircraft that, below 500 meters, can enter and exit turns at angular rates that seem physically impossible. A pilot who understands this can use right rudder to yaw the nose right, exploiting the gyroscopic precession to simultaneously pitch the nose up, then coordinate with aileron to roll into a climbing right turn with an instantaneous turn radius of less than 30 meters. The Camel effectively pivots around its own center of mass. To an opponent in a conventional aircraft, it looks like the Camel has simply teleported to a new position. This is what Lieutenant Hans Weiss experienced on the 18th of March. This is what dozens of other German pilots would experience in the months that followed. But understanding the effect and exploiting it were two different things. The RAF, the Royal Air Force, which absorbed the RFC in April 1918, did not have a theory of gyroscopic combat at low altitude. What they had were combat veterans who had survived long enough to stumble onto the technique through trial and error and who passed it down to new pilots through informal mentorship. The official training manual for the Camel, published in July 1917, contains not a single mention of the low-altitude turning advantage. It warns extensively about the gyroscopic precession and the tendency to spin, but it frames these as problems to be avoided, not capabilities to be exploited. Riprova Claude può commettere errori, verifica sempre le risposte con attenzione. The unofficial knowledge lived in the squadron ready rooms and the dispersal tents. It was passed along in fragments, often over mugs of tea laced with rum, after missions when pilots were still shaking from adrenaline. Keep it low, the veterans would say. Below 500 feet, the Camel is God. Above 2,000, you're a target. They described techniques that had no names, no official doctrine. The hammerhead turn, executed by yanking full right rudder and letting the gyroscopic effect snap the nose up and around. The spiral descent, where you rolled inverted and let the engine's torque pull you through a corkscrew that tightened as you descended. The deck turn, performed at treetop height, where you could reverse direction in less space than a tennis court. One pilot, Captain James McCudden of No. 56 Squadron, kept detailed notes that would later be published in his memoir, Flying Fury. McCudden was methodical, almost scientific in his approach to combat flying. He logged 195 hours in the Camel and claimed 57 victories before his death in July 1918. His notes contain some of the most precise descriptions of the low-altitude phenomenon. He wrote, "The machine at ground level possesses a turning ability that defies rational explanation. I have frequently reversed course completely while my opponent was still executing his first 90 degrees of turn. The effect is most pronounced when the throttle is fully open and the engine speed maximum. At this point, the Camel does not so much turn as rotate, pivoting about its center with the tail describing a tight arc while the nose remains nearly stationary relative to the ground." McCudden documented something else that would prove crucial. Altitude loss during these maneuvers was minimal. A conventional aircraft executing a hard turn at low altitude must pull significant G-forces, which increases induced drag and causes rapid energy loss. The aircraft descends unless the pilot adds power and accepts a wider turn radius. But the Camel's rotation was different. Because it was exploiting gyroscopic precession rather than purely aerodynamic forces, it could maintain altitude while pivoting through impossibly tight arcs. McCudden wrote, "I have turned inside a Fokker triplane at less than 100 feet altitude and completed the reversal with a gain of 50 feet. The Fokker, meanwhile, had descended 200 feet and was still 90 degrees from his desired heading. I shot him from above and behind before he understood what had occurred." The tactical implications were enormous, but they required a complete inversion of standard fighter doctrine. Every Air Force in 1917 and 1918 taught its pilots to maintain altitude advantage. Height equals energy equals life. Dive on your opponent from above, make your attack, zoom back to altitude, never get slow, never get low. These principles worked for every fighter, except the camel. In a camel, getting low was not a disadvantage, it was the entire point. Camel pilots developed a style of combat that was unique in the war. They would deliberately descend during an engagement, luring their opponents down to altitudes where the camel's physics worked in their favor. Major William Barker, a Canadian ace who scored 50 victories in camels, described the technique in a 1919 interview. The Hun has been taught to fight at altitude. He is comfortable there. His aircraft perform well there, so you must make him uncomfortable. You dive away, apparently fleeing. He follows because this confirms his sense of superiority. You level out at 500 feet, seemingly trapped against the ground. He is confident now. He positions for the killing shot, and then you show him what the camel can do. You wrench it around in a turn that should be impossible. You are on his tail before he can process what has happened. He panics. He tries to outturn you, but his aircraft cannot. He tries to climb away, but he is too low and too slow. You kill him there, in the grass, where the camel is king. The statistics bear this out. Analysis of combat reports from camel squadrons between April and November 1918 shows a striking pattern. Over 70% of camel victories occurred below 1,000 meters altitude. Over 40% occurred below 500 meters. This is completely inverted compared to other British fighters. The SE.5A, for example, scored 68% of its victories above 2,000 meters. The Bristol fighter scored 59% above 3,000 meters. The camel was a low-altitude specialist, and the specialization was not by design, but by accident, an emergent property of its dysfunctional physics that turned into a weapon. But there was a dark side to this capability, and it appeared in the casualty statistics with brutal clarity. The same gyroscopic effects that made the camel dominant at low altitude made it lethal to inexperienced pilots at any altitude. The aircraft had no forgiveness in it. A moment of inattention, a too aggressive control input, a distraction at the wrong instant, and the camel would depart controlled flight. The spin that resulted was flat, fast, and usually unrecoverable below 1,000 meters. The aircraft would rotate around its vertical axis like a falling leaf, descending at over 2,000 feet per minute. Pilots had perhaps 20 seconds to recognize the spin, reduce power, apply opposite rudder, and push the nose down aggressively. Most did not have 20 seconds. Most did not recognize the spin until it was too late. The training establishment tried to address this with ground school and simulator time. But there was no substitute for actual flight experience. Pilots needed 10 to 15 hours in the camel before the gyroscopic effects became instinctive, before they stopped fighting the aircraft and started working with its peculiar physics. But in early 1918, the RFC was desperate for pilots. Training times were compressed. Young men with 30 hours total flight time were being sent to operational squadrons. They would arrive, climb into a camel for the first time, and be dead within a week, not killed by Germans, killed by the aircraft itself. Flight Lieutenant Arthur Gould Lee, who flew camels with No. 46 Squadron, wrote extensively about this in his diary. Lee was one of the lucky ones. He survived both the camel and the war, but he watched a procession of replacement pilots arrive, struggle with the aircraft, and die. He wrote in August 1918, "Another new man today, Hewitt from Birmingham. 19 years old, 35 hours total time. I took him up for a familiarization flight, showed him the basics. The next morning he took off for solo practice, got to 500 feet, attempted a turn, entered a spin, dead before the ambulance arrived. He had been with us less than 18 hours. This is not war. This is murder by machinery." Lee's diary entries capture the psychological toll of flying the camel. Pilots were simultaneously terrified of the aircraft and dependent on it for survival. They knew it could kill them through a moment's carelessness, but they also knew that if they mastered it, they would have an advantage no German pilot could match. This created a strange culture in camel squadrons. Pilots were superstitious about the aircraft. They developed rituals, checking specific components in specific orders, patting the cowling before flight, refusing to fly certain airframes that were considered unlucky. They gave their aircraft names, not affectionate nicknames but darker monikers: the Widowmaker, Spinning Jenny, the Reaper. And yet, paradoxically, veteran camel pilots were intensely loyal to the type. Pilots who survived their first 20 hours in the aircraft, who learned to anticipate and exploit its behavior, would refuse transfers to other types. They were offered SE.5As, which were faster and safer. They were offered Bristol fighters, which were more stable and had a gunner for protection. They declined. They stayed with the camel. When asked why, they gave variations of the same answer. because nothing else can do what it does. The spring offensive of 1918 became the proving ground for these tactics. German forces had broken through Allied lines in multiple sectors, advancing as much as 60 kilometers in some areas. The British Army was in retreat. Ground commanders were desperate for air support, reconnaissance to track German movements, ground attack to slow the advance, and most critically, air superiority to prevent German aircraft from directing artillery fire onto the retreating columns. The RFC threw everything it had into the battle. Camel squadrons were flying 4 and 5 sorties per day, operating from forward airfields that were sometimes within range of German artillery. The combat reports from this period read like a catalog of impossible aerial geometry. Lieutenant William Claxton of No. 73 Squadron reported engaging a formation of 4 Albatross D.5 fighters at 1,500 meters on March 24th. Claxton was alone, separated from his flight. The German formation had altitude and numbers. Standard doctrine said he should dive away. Instead, Claxton descended to 300 meters and circled, daring the Germans to follow. 2 did. Claxton's report describes what happened next. The first Hun came down fast, overshooting my turn circle. I reversed direction using full right rudder and engine torque, completed reversal in perhaps 3 seconds, was on his tail at point-blank range, fired 1 burst. He went into the ground immediately. Second Hun attempted to climb away. I pulled up using gyroscopic precession to pitch nose vertical while maintaining forward speed, fired upward into his belly. He exploded. Entire engagement lasted less than 30 seconds. Altitude throughout remained below 400 meters. This was not an isolated incident. Similar reports flooded in from every Camel squadron. The Germans initially interpreted these as exaggerations or propaganda, but they could not explain the casualty rates. Jagdstaffels that had dominated the skies in 1917 were being mauled. Experienced German pilots, men with 20 and 30 victories, were being shot down by British pilots with just weeks of combat experience. The critical factor was always altitude. If the fight stayed high, German numerical and technical superiority prevailed. If it descended below 1,000 meters, the Camels became dominant. German intelligence services captured several Camels and subjected them to exhaustive testing. The reports from these evaluations reveal both the sophistication of German aeronautical engineering and their fundamental misunderstanding of what they were dealing with. Test pilots at Adlershof, the German Army's main aviation testing facility, flew the Camel extensively. Their reports noted the gyroscopic effects, the tendency to spin, the difficulty of control. They concluded that the Camel was an inferior aircraft, dangerous to its own pilots, and that its combat success must be due to superior British pilot training or numerical advantage. What they failed to understand was that the Camel's defects were its weapons, but only in a specific flight regime that German test pilots never explored because they considered low-altitude maneuvering combat to be tactically unsound. This was not stupidity. German fighter doctrine in 1918 was based on sound principles that worked for their aircraft. The Fokker D.7, which entered service in April 1918, was possibly the best high-altitude fighter of the war. It could outclimb and outmaneuver anything the Allies had at 3,000 meters and above. German pilots were trained to use this advantage. They climbed above Allied formations, dove through them at high speed, then climbed back to altitude. This tactic, called the zoom and boom, maximized the Fokker's strengths. The idea of deliberately descending to low altitude and engaging in turning combat there made no sense in the context of German aircraft and doctrine. Their fighters had conventional mass distribution and conventional engines. At low altitude, they gained no special advantage. They simply became more vulnerable to ground fire. But the British, flying Camels, were playing a different game. They forced combats into the altitude band where their aircraft's physics worked. Squadron commanders developed tactics specifically designed to drag German fighters down. The bait and trap became standard. A pair of Camels would patrol at high altitude, acting as bait. When German fighters climbed to engage, the Camels would dive, not directly away but in a spiral that forced the Germans to follow in a descending turn. Meanwhile, a second flight of Camels circled at low altitude, waiting. When the Germans descended below 1,000 meters, pursuing what they thought was a fleeing enemy, they entered the killing zone. The low Camels would engage, using their superior low-altitude turning to get inside the German turn circles. The fight would spiral down to 300 or 400 meters, where the Camel's advantage was maximum. Captain Albert Ball, before his death in May 1917, had pioneered these tactics in the earlier Sopwith Pup. But the Pup's low-altitude advantage was marginal. The Camel's was overwhelming. By summer of 1918, German fighter pilots had learned to avoid low-altitude turning combat with Camels. Squadron intelligence summaries captured from German units contain explicit warnings. One document from Jagdstaffel 11, dated July 1918, states, "Under no circumstances engage the Sopwith single-seater in sustained turning combat below 1,000 meters. The British machine possesses a turning capability at low altitude that cannot be matched. Maintain altitude advantage. Use vertical tactics only. Break off engagement rather than descend." This was a stunning development. The German air service, which had dominated Allied air power for much of 1917, was now issuing defensive doctrine specifically to avoid combat with a particular Allied aircraft type under particular conditions. The strategic implications were significant. If German fighters would not contest control of the airspace below 1,000 meters, then Camel squadrons could operate there with impunity. This meant effective close air support for ground forces, unmolested reconnaissance below cloud layers, and interdiction of German supply lines. The numbers tell the story. Between April and November 1918, Sopwith Camels flew over 380,000 combat sorties. They claimed 1,394 confirmed aerial victories, more than any other Allied fighter type. But the loss rates were also staggering. Over 2,400 Camels were lost to all causes during this period. Of these, approximately 1,100 were combat losses. The remaining 1,300 were lost to accidents, most during training or transit flights. The Camel had a peacetime accident rate that was higher than the combat loss rate of safer aircraft types. It was simultaneously the most effective and the most dangerous aircraft in Allied service. Pilots developed an extensive oral tradition around Camel flying techniques. These were not written down in official documents because they often involved deliberately violating official regulations. For example, regulations required pilots to maintain minimum altitudes of 1,000 feet except during takeoff and landing. But Camel combat tactics required routine operation at 300 feet or less. Regulations prohibited aerobatic maneuvers below 2,000 feet, but the hammerhead turn and spiral descent that made the Camel effective were essentially aerobatic maneuvers performed at ground level. Squadron commanders looked the other way. They understood that official doctrine did not match combat reality. The most experienced Camel pilots pushed the aircraft to its absolute limits. They discovered that at maximum engine speed and minimum altitude, you could perform maneuvers that seemed to violate basic aerodynamics. Major Donald McLaren, a Canadian ace with 54 victories, described one technique in particular. If you enter a right turn at full power at less than 200 feet, the aircraft will pivot around a point in space while actually gaining altitude. The gyroscopic effect lifts the nose while the turn is executing. You can complete a 180-degree reversal and be 50 feet higher than when you started. I have used this to reverse on an opponent and simultaneously gain position above him. He perceives it as impossible and hesitates, trying to understand what occurred. That hesitation is fatal. Riprova Claude può commettere errori. Verifica sempre le risposte con attenzione. Sonnet 4.5. The weapon's effectiveness generated its own mythology. German pilots began attributing near-supernatural capabilities to the Camel, which worked in the British favor psychologically but obscured the actual physics at play. Intelligence reports from prisoner interrogations in mid-1918 show German pilots describing Camels as having British secret engines or special control systems not visible from outside. One captured pilot from Jagdstaffel 27 claimed the Camel had hidden gyroscopes in the wings that allowed impossible maneuvers. He was partially correct but completely wrong. The gyroscope was the engine itself, and there was nothing hidden about it. What the Germans were observing but could not explain was the compound effect of gyroscopic precession and control authority in dense air acting on a highly concentrated mass distribution. At sea level, air density is approximately 1.2 kilograms per cubic meter. At 5,000 meters, it drops to approximately 0.7 kilograms per cubic meter. This seems like a modest difference, but aerodynamic force is directly proportional to air density. A control surface that generates 100 kilograms of force at 5,000 meters generates 170 kilograms of force at sea level. Now apply this to an aircraft whose rotational inertia about the vertical axis is unusually low due to concentrated mass distribution. The control authority increases by 70% while the resistance to rotation remains constant. The result is an angular acceleration that increases non-linearly with decreasing altitude. British aeronautical engineers at the Royal Aircraft Factory at Farnborough were aware that something unusual was happening with the Camel, but they struggled to quantify it with the mathematical tools available in 1918. They had no concept of rotational dynamics in the modern sense. The field of rigid body dynamics was still developing. What they had were empirical observations from combat pilots and test flights, plus some basic measurements of control forces and aircraft response. In July 1918, the factory conducted a series of tests with a Camel fitted with instrumentation to measure control surface deflections and aircraft angular rates. The test pilot was Captain Frank Courtney, an experienced aviator who had flown most types in RFC service. Courtney's report is one of the few contemporary documents that attempts a technical explanation of the phenomenon. He wrote, "The aircraft exhibits markedly different handling characteristics as a function of altitude. At 4,000 feet, rudder input of 10 degrees produces a yaw rate of approximately 8 degrees per second, with significant adverse effects from engine precession requiring constant correction. At 500 feet, the same 10-degree rudder input produces a yaw rate exceeding 20 degrees per second, with precession effects actually enhancing the turn rather than opposing it. The aircraft pivots rather than arcs. At 200 feet with full power, I measured instantaneous yaw rates approaching 35 degrees per second, which implies a full reversal of heading in approximately 5 seconds. I have observed no other aircraft capable of this performance." 35 degrees per second was extraordinary. For comparison, the Fokker D.7 could sustain approximately 12 degrees per second in a level turn at optimal altitude. The SE.5A achieved about 15 degrees per second. The Camel, at ground level, was achieving more than twice this rate while maintaining altitude and airspeed. Courtney's report recommended further investigation, but the war ended before systematic study could be undertaken. The phenomenon was documented but not understood. What made this particularly significant was how it translated to combat effectiveness. In a turning fight, the aircraft that can complete its turn first gains the positional advantage. If one aircraft can turn at 15 degrees per second and another at 30 degrees per second, the faster turning aircraft will be on the slower aircraft's tail after just 6 seconds of combat maneuvering. 6 seconds in a dogfight is an eternity. It is the difference between firing position and being fired upon. Camel pilots who understood this used it ruthlessly. They would bait German fighters into low-altitude turning contests, knowing that after the first reversal, they would have an insurmountable positional advantage. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound. Combat is already intensely stressful, but when your opponent appears to be operating under different physical laws, the stress becomes existential. German squadron diaries from summer and autumn 1918 contain repeated references to pilot morale problems specifically related to Camel encounters. Pilots who had survived 10 or 20 combats against other Allied types would request transfer after a single encounter with a Camel at low altitude. Squadron commanders reported difficulty convincing pilots to descend below 1,000 meters even when tactical situations required it. One particularly detailed account comes from the diary of Lieutenant Ernst Udet, who would survive the war as Germany's second highest scoring ace with 62 victories. Udet encountered Camels multiple times and learned to avoid them under certain conditions. He wrote in August 1918, "Engaged a lone Camel east of Albert. I had altitude advantage, 2,000 meters to his 1,000. I dove, built speed, prepared for a single pass, but he did not attempt to evade. He descended instead, forcing me to follow if I wished to engage. Against my better judgment, I followed him down. At 500 meters, I was still above and behind him, perfect position. I fired a burst, missed. He suddenly was not where my sights indicated. The machine seemed to rotate on its propeller hub. I was looking at his nose, then his flank, then he was behind me. I dove to ground level and fled at full throttle. He did not pursue, merely waggled his wings and climbed away. I understood then that he had been teaching me, showing me what would happen if I pressed the attack. I did not engage Camels at low altitude again." Udet's account captures something essential. The Camel was not just superior at low altitude, it was so dramatically superior that it functioned as a different category of weapon. This created a strange dichotomy in the air war. Above 2,000 meters, German fighters maintained qualitative superiority. Below 1,000 meters, Camels were dominant. The airspace between became a contested zone where neither side held a decisive advantage. Combats would often begin at medium altitude and then separate into vertical layers, with German aircraft climbing and British aircraft descending to their preferred fighting altitudes. This vertical segregation of the battlefield had not been seen before in aerial warfare. It was driven entirely by the performance characteristics of one specific aircraft type interacting with the physical properties of the atmosphere. The phenomenon was so pronounced that some British commanders advocated for developing tactics around it. Major General John Salmond, who commanded the RAF in France in 1918, wrote in a September tactical directive, "The Camel is not a general-purpose fighter. It is a specialist weapon optimized for a specific altitude band. Employment must reflect this. Camel patrols should be structured to draw enemy aircraft into low-altitude engagements where our advantage is maximum. Other types should maintain altitude cover to prevent enemy exploitation of vertical escape. This was sophisticated tactical thinking, but it came late in the war. By September 1918, the German army was in retreat. The Allied offensives that would end the war were underway. Air combat, while still intense, was no longer the decisive factor it had been during the Spring Crisis. The Camel had played its role. It had held the line during the most desperate months when German advances threatened to break the Allied position. The 1,394 confirmed victories were not just statistics. They represented German reconnaissance aircraft that did not direct artillery onto retreating British columns, German ground attack aircraft that did not strafe supply lines, German fighters that did not shoot down the observation balloons that guided Allied counter-battery fire. But what happened to the knowledge? Why did the Camel's low-altitude capability not translate into design principles for future aircraft? The answer lies in the technological transition that occurred immediately after the war. Rotary engines became obsolete almost overnight. They were replaced by static radial and inline engines that produced more power with better fuel efficiency and none of the gyroscopic complications. The concentrated mass distribution that made the Camel effective also made it unstable and dangerous. Future designers consciously moved away from this configuration. The lessons of the Camel were not lessons in what to do, but lessons in what to avoid. The post-war RAF conducted extensive analysis of wartime aircraft performance. The reports are fascinating documents that reveal how little the contemporary engineers understood about what they had created. A 1920 report titled Comparative Performance of Fighter Types in Combat Conditions devotes 3 paragraphs to the Camel. It notes the high victory rate and the high accident rate. It attributes the victory rate to aggressive pilots and willingness to engage at close range. It mentions the low-altitude turning capability only in passing, as a curiosity rather than the defining characteristic. The report recommends against rotary engines and short-coupled airframes for future fighters. The physics that made the Camel effective were interpreted as defects to be eliminated rather than phenomena to be understood and potentially exploited. This was not unique to the British. American and French post-war analyses reached similar conclusions. The Camel was filed away as a dangerous aberration, successful despite its flaws rather than because of its unique properties. The design paradigm shifted toward stability, predictability, and pilot safety. The next generation of fighters, the Bristol Bulldog, the Hawker Fury, the American P-12, were conventional aircraft with conventional handling. They were faster than the Camel, better armed, more reliable. They were also completely incapable of the ultra-low altitude maneuvering that had made the Camel lethal. It would take another war and another revolution in aircraft design before engineers rediscovered some of what the Camel had stumbled upon. The jet fighters of the 1950s and 60s would encounter similar issues with mass distribution and control authority at different altitudes, though driven by different physics. The F-4 Phantom, for example, had notorious pitch-up characteristics at certain combinations of speed and altitude that bore a conceptual similarity to the Camel's behavior, though the underlying causes were different. Modern fly-by-wire systems in fighters like the F-16 deliberately create what amounts to controlled instability, using computers to maintain an aircraft on the edge of departure from controlled flight because this maximizes maneuverability. The Camel was doing something similar, but with a human pilot as the control system. Today, approximately a dozen airworthy Sopwith Camel replicas exist worldwide, maintained by museums and private collectors. Flying one is considered among the most challenging experiences in vintage aviation. Modern pilots, even those with thousands of hours in high-performance aircraft, require extensive training before soloing a Camel. The aircraft has not become easier to fly with age. If anything, contemporary pilots trained on stable, forgiving modern aircraft find the Camel more difficult than their World War I counterparts, who learned to fly in an era when all aircraft were difficult and dangerous. Tom Kaler, a Virginia-based pilot who has logged over 300 hours in a replica Camel, describes the experience. The first time you open the throttle for takeoff, the aircraft tries to swap ends on you. The torque wants to weather vane you into the wind. You are standing on full left rudder before you have 50 feet of ground roll. You get airborne, and the slightest pressure on the stick produces an immediate and dramatic response, but not quite in the direction you intended. You are constantly correcting, anticipating, staying ahead of the aircraft. It is exhausting. After a 30-minute flight, I am as mentally drained as after a 2-hour cross-country in a modern aircraft. But Kaler and other Camel pilots also described the phenomenon that Lieutenant Hans Weiss encountered in March 1918. If you are below 500 feet and you enter a hard turn, the aircraft does something that you do not quite believe even as you are experiencing it. It pivots. I have flown a lot of different aircraft. I have flown aerobatic competitions. I have never flown anything that turns like a camel at low altitude. You can reverse your heading in less space than you would think possible. The first time it happens, your brain cannot process it. You think you have made an error, that the altimeter is wrong, that you have somehow gone inverted without noticing. But no, the aircraft has simply rotated around a point in space while maintaining altitude and airspeed. It is the weirdest thing. Modern pilots have the advantage of understanding the physics involved. They know about gyroscopic precession, about air density effects, about rotational dynamics. But knowing intellectually and experiencing viscerally are different things. The Camel still surprises. It still kills, though rarely. 3 replica Camels have crashed since 1990, with 2 fatalities. In each case, the accident investigation revealed the same cause: loss of control during low-speed maneuvering at low altitude, followed by an unrecoverable spin. The exact sequence that killed over 400 pilots during the war still claims victims a century later. The legacy of the Camel extends beyond aviation into the broader understanding of how complex systems behave. The aircraft was a product of engineering compromises driven by wartime necessity. Nobody sat down and designed an aircraft that would exploit gyroscopic effects in dense air. Nobody calculated the optimal mass distribution for ultra-low altitude maneuvering combat. The Camel emerged from practical constraints: available engines, material limitations, production capacity. Its defining characteristic was an accident. But that accident, combined with the desperation of combat and the ingenuity of pilots, created something that fundamentally changed aerial warfare for the duration of its service. This pattern of emergent properties arising from design constraints and revealing themselves only under specific operational conditions appears throughout the history of military technology. The Camel is a particularly clear example because the property was so pronounced and so counterintuitive. But similar effects occur with naval vessels, ground vehicles, and weapon systems. Performance in the design environment does not always predict performance in the operational environment. The environment itself is a variable, and for the Camel, the critical environmental variable was altitude. The question of why this knowledge did not propagate into future designs has a complex answer. Partly, it was technological obsolescence. Rotary engines vanished, eliminating the primary driver of the effect. Partly, it was institutional conservatism. Post-war air forces prioritized stability and safety over extreme maneuverability. Partly, it was conceptual. Engineers lacked the theoretical framework to understand what they were observing, so they could not abstract principles that might apply to different designs. And partly, it was cultural. The pilots who understood the Camel's capabilities were either dead, scattered to civilian life after demobilization, or promoted into command positions where they no longer flew. The few attempts to preserve the knowledge were fragmentary. William Barker, the Canadian ace, gave a series of lectures at the RAF Staff College in 1921 on fighter tactics. His notes, preserved in the Canadian archives, contain detailed descriptions of low-altitude Camel combat techniques, but these lectures were not widely distributed, and the specific tactics were increasingly irrelevant as aircraft technology evolved. By the mid-1920s, fighters had doubled in speed and quadrupled in power. Combat was happening at different altitudes, different speeds, with different weapons. The Camel's techniques no longer applied. The scientific literature largely ignored the Camel. A search of aeronautical engineering journals from 1918 through 1930 reveals fewer than a dozen articles that mention the type, and none that attempt to explain its low-altitude performance. The phenomenon was too specific, too tied to one obsolete aircraft type. It fell into the gap between practical aviation knowledge, which was held by pilots and passed along informally, and academic aeronautical engineering, which focused on first principles and generalizable theories. The Camel was an anomaly that fit neither category. Modern computational fluid dynamics could now model the Camel's behavior precisely. The interaction between gyroscopic forces, aerodynamic forces, and aircraft mass distribution could be simulated to arbitrary precision. But by the time these tools existed, the Camel was a historical curiosity rather than an active research topic. The few studies that have been done confirm what combat pilots observed. The aircraft's turn performance at low altitude was extraordinary for its era and remains impressive even by modern standards. A properly flown Camel at 300 feet altitude can sustain turn rates that match or exceed many World War II fighters and approach the capabilities of early jets. This has implications for how we understand technological development. The best tool for a job is not always the most advanced tool or the most sophisticated tool. Sometimes it is the tool whose properties happen to align with a specific operational requirement, even if those properties are accidental. The Camel was not the best fighter aircraft of World War I in any general sense. It was slower than the Spad-3, less stable than the SE.5A, more dangerous than the Bristol fighter. But for one specific mission, low-altitude air superiority, it was unmatched. And in the critical months of spring and summer 1918, that specific mission was exactly what the situation required. The men who flew the Camel occupy a unique position in aviation history. They were not flying the most advanced aircraft. They were flying one of the most difficult and dangerous. They suffered casualty rates that would be unacceptable in any modern military context. But they also experienced something that no pilot before or since has quite replicated, an aircraft that, under specific conditions, performed impossible maneuvers. That made them feel, in those moments at low altitude with the engine howling and the aircraft pivoting around them, like they were bending the laws of physics to their will. If you visit the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon today, you can see a surviving Camel. It hangs from the ceiling of the main hall, suspended in a diving turn. The placard beneath describes it as difficult but effective, and lists the impressive victory total. But the placard cannot convey what it was like to fly this machine at 300 feet over the Western Front with a German fighter on your tail, to yank the stick and rudder and feel the aircraft snap around as if the laws of motion had been momentarily suspended, to find yourself suddenly behind your opponent with your guns trained on his cockpit, and to know in that instant that you were flying something that should not be able to do what it just did. That knowledge died with the last Camel pilots. What remains is the aircraft itself, silent and still, and the numbers in the record books that hint at what it was capable of when flown by someone who understood its secrets. 1,394 victories, over 400 training fatalities, and a phenomenon that pilots could feel in their hands and guts, but that engineers could not explain. The Sopwith Camel was never supposed to be a great fighter. But at low altitude, where the air was thick and the gyroscopes howled and the physics of rotation overwhelmed the physics of flight, it was the most lethal aircraft in the sky. And for 8 months in 1918, that was enough. If this story has shown you anything, it is that war accelerates innovation in ways that peacetime never does, and that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones nobody planned. The next time you see a vintage aircraft at an air show or museum, remember that its capabilities were discovered not in wind tunnels or on drawing boards, but in the sky, by men who were desperately trying not to die, and who stumbled onto properties that changed everything. And if you want to understand more about how engineering accidents became tactical advantages, how constraints drove innovation, and how the desperate mathematics of combat revealed phenomena that science had not yet explained, there are more stories like this one. Subscribe to make sure you do not miss them. Because the history of technology is not just about what was built, it is about what was discovered in the using.